All right. Excellent. Welcome. This is the first event of the 2021 nextSPACE Winter Spring Series with GroundWorks Dance Theater. My name's Christy Bolingbroke. I am the Executive Artistic Director for the National Center for Choreography here in Akron, and I am delighted to welcome Hannah Garner as our guest artist and choreographer this evening. Hello, Hannah.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing well. How are you doing? Let's start there. Just kind of settle in.
Oh, I'm doing good. I'm doing great. I'm here in my apartment in Manhattan,
Mhm.
hanging out. I'm doing a little cute quarantine before I come on out to Cleveland. So I'm laying low, just doing some work, and yeah, hanging in there, same as everyone else is, I would think.
Right? I mean, certainly as members of the dance community, we understand momentum and a body in motion stays in motion. So even if that your space is that much smaller, glad to hear that you're keeping on. And that's also why we are chatting tonight because you're going to be coming out to do a project with GroundWorks. And in our prep chat, you acknowledge like you don't have a lot of experience in Northeast Ohio and vice versa. Northeast Ohio maybe has not heard of you and your work before. So would love to just start to understand like how or when did you know that you wanted to be a choreographer? Take us kind of back somewhere in that. I don't know if you want to go to your childhood or how far back you want to go, but just curious always if there's a moment where you just know.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. I don't know that I will have like a moment for you, just as a preface to this conversation, but um yeah, I've been kind of surrounded by the performing arts for my entire life. Both of my parents were actors, and my father is still an actor, and um so I orbited that performing arts world for a really long time without fully knowing how I fit into it, though, like knowing that I wanted to. And I remember um, growing up, going to the theater with my dad. He was in the 2003 revival of Gypsy, and I would go in every Sunday and watch like one act of the matinee. So I was just like seeing these incredible performers, doing their thing. And also, that is a show about the performing arts and about making a life in vaudeville and burlesque, um and yeah, so I think like I knew I was interested in the performing arts for a long time. I thought that it was musical theater. I thought it was acting. I thought it was all these other things before I kind of found dance later than some people who pursue a career in dance, which was in high school. Really a little bit earlier than that, I started tap dancing, but I didn't really explore any kinds of like modern contemporary ballet situation until high school. And I don't know where choreography kind of landed in that. In high school, I would choreograph dances for fun with like my friends or people that I was in like young performing arts companies, ensembles with, and then um, pursuing pursuing dance as a career onto college. I went to SUNY Purchase College in the Conservatory of Dance, where at the time, and I don't know how the program has evolved since then, you could select a concentration.
Mm.
So there was an audition to become like a composition concentration, and I auditioned for it and was selected on my work and was able to major in a double concentration of composition and performance. And I think there would probably be where my interest in choreography really took root, just like the amount of performances I was able to see and also like dance in, and then just with like constant improvisation and composition classes, really harnessing that that idea, that like really small inkling that it was something that I was interested in. And since graduating, I just haven't stopped making work in any capacity.
Yeah, no, I mean, and to have that event, I'm also I want to acknowledge, like, I hear so much as whether people choose to study the performing arts or whatever they choose to study in college, like there certainly is that pressure that you have to choose, like this is going to set you up for the rest of your life. It sounds like you also had a lot of space to try on how you might find your way in dance from your college experience. So that's really huge. And that it's worked out for you and you continue to explore as you're making professionally too now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things certainly from NCC Akron standpoint, and then also as a recovering marketer myself, I think one of the scariest invitations that can be uttered sometimes is come to my dance show, because it can mean so many different things, right? Like, oh my God, is it going to be stillness for an hour? Or like, am I going to get it? There's so much loaded in that simple invitation. So for those that aren't familiar with your work, um, I'd love to hear like how you might describe your movement or performance aesthetic in your own words, and then we'll kind of pull apart some of the things that I saw in the samples you shared with me.
Yeah, for sure. That's so funny that you say that because that's so real. And it's like also from describe, like I can describe it as much as I want to, and it still will be like, you won't until you see it.
You
Like,
got to be there. Yeah.
live performing arts. That's a whole thing. But yeah, to describe my work, I mean, I make generally I make work under the name Second Best Dance Company with a bunch of my friends who dance or agree with me. But I often describe my work as dance plays, and that can be something like very literal, like one of the last major works that we made and performed before, you know, all of this went down and we live in the world that we do right now, was called Red, and it was like based on the story Little Red Riding Hood. So that's kind of like a literal, we understand the story and the play, and it was deconstructed and had all these new kind of meanings added to it. Or the dance play can be something that's like way less literal. It will resemble the structure of a play in like scenes and scenarios, but it can be non-linear and nonsensical and just be kind of a bunch of different ideas strung together into one conglomerate with some kind of a through line. And the vocabulary varies. There's a lot of dance. There's a lot of dance movement, and it comes from my training. And I'd say that the dance vocabulary style would be like a release technique. We use a lot of weighted movement and momentum, paired with kind of what we would call in the dance world the pedestrian movement, which to me is just real reactions to things and being in the moment. And then the vocabulary also expands to include text a lot of the time. I'll like write scripts that we'll use in a performance, or we'll use kind of like improvisational tasks to develop text and pair that with movement and see how they flow together, or how they combat each other, which can be equally interesting.
I mean, what I hear, and just from what I've sampled, there is a multifacetedness. It's interesting for you to use the term dance play because there often is some form of text. And also this idea of pedestrian, but not just from a movement standpoint. I think I might offer up for those because they, you know, eventually the GroundWorks community will get to see what you make with the company. And there's these moments of like, it's just real and human, right? It isn't people like performing that now I'm dancing, but they're kind of like stop and make eye contact with each other and like break that performance persona for a second. That feels very real. And I was like, they're people too. How nice, right? So that you're not trying to be this like other or somehow a blank canvas, which we know is not possible with the body as an instrument either. Where do you begin? Like, where do you start when you sit down to make up a dance or stand up to make up a dance?
Yeah, I think there, you know, it will depend on the project, but I think there are like two kind of major two major ways that I do, and one will be kind of having a theme or a story or something that I'm interested in exploring, like again the example of Little Red Riding Hood, and like kind of taking that theme in a direction, or it will be more image based, or like I feel like I collect a lot of like small ideas and like to figure out how those go together. So it will be like a small piece of writing that I've done that I'm interested to see how like that can be like blown up to a bigger scale, or just like a specific orientation of bodies that I'm interested in seeing. And I think a lot of where I start is just like where I'm at the time. Like a lot of my content feels very personal to me. It feels like the things that I think about a lot are the things that I'm going through. So those subjects tend to like arc back towards like death and mortality or failure or queer identity, or where we hold sensation in our bodies. And I think kind of where I'm at will really determine how a process starts.
I mean, of course, you are also human. You bring that into the experience. The idea of starting with writing, and this maybe also taps your term dance play. When we talked, and I said, well, are you prepping at all for what you'll walk into the room with on day one with GroundWorks? And you told me like you had been writing a script, like you had an idea down, and we don't always have scripts in dance. So I'm curious, can you elucidate a little bit more like what that looks like? Is it as we would expect, like dancer 1 will do this, dancer 2 will do that, or is it actual text that you often incorporate? I'm just curious how you frame the story and doing your own homework.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because when I say script, like I really do, I am thinking about text, but hearing you say like, is that like movement too? And that actually like makes me realize that I do have like kind of multiple scripts in play, and some of it
taking notes, those are possible in place. Yeah.
So I will have like a script of, if I have a duet idea and I'm currently living alone in my apartment and have no bodies to execute that on, I will write down, a movement script of like how I think something will go, or like really like rough outlines of an idea. But then I will also often work on scripts that are text. So it will be dancer 1 says this, dancer 2 says this, or I'll make up, characters in my head that kind of like claim those roles. And I mean, a lot of my process, I was gonna say, like centers on writing. Writing has revealed itself as like a big part of my process in like the past few years, and some of that is just like working on bigger scale projects and like needing to like literally remember what I was thinking of the day before when I have like a lot of stuff in my head, and then some of it is just like reflective writing, or some of it is, I was thinking about this movement idea that actually might be portrayed better in just like saying how I'm feeling out loud, or like if I'm performing a duet with this performer, but like something that I need to communicate is better communicated verbally than physically, than just allowing the space for that to happen.
There's something that dance theater maker Joe Good is quoted as saying that everyone knows dancing and speaking cancel each other out. That it's like almost too hard for the audience to process the movement and the language at the same time. And that, one person's opinion, but I will also share from my personal experience, and I think we talked about this a little bit, like it either works or it doesn't work. You can have dancers who are trying to act, or you can have actors who are trying to dance and move. But that balance, so that those two actions aren't fighting with each other, is a real challenge. And it's interesting to hear the personal nature of your sort of starting place because when I saw the solo you were commissioned by a SUNY Purchase, I think senior, to make, It's Almost Better. That was so interesting because it was one person, right? So how much talking is one person going to do when they have no one to dialogue with? And it felt like the language, the speaking was actually the subtext in dialogue with the movement. So sometimes the movement was this big, juicy language, and you're like, oh, like, and very musical. And then there would be some speaking that was almost like undermining, or what you would say normally under your breath, except this person happened to have a microphone, so we all heard it. And then sometimes the movement was really awkward, but this person was just like, and this is the way we go. So playing with those emotional tones, it helped me better understand how you navigate the relationship between language and speaking and movement. I wanted to share, like, it was such a clearly crafted idea and so simple when it was just a single body, that I was like, oh, all right, this is interesting. Yeah. But then you've also done some music videos, and there's an inherent narrative or story a lot of times in songwriting. What is your relationship normally to just music in your own work? At what point does that come into the process, or how do you choose to use it?
Yeah. I'm going to backtrack 1 second to what you said about text.
This is your conversation. Yeah.
Little asterisk and footnote that, like, also it doesn't always work. Like, I could bring in like an entire script that I wrote, and like we'll do it and we'll workshop it and we'll try a lot of things, and it just like won't be right, or like we won't be able to get it, and then you know how it goes. So that's just out the window. But also it informs the process in other ways, and it makes itself heard in ways that aren't us saying it out.
Permission to deviate from the script, then.
That is a big part of it as well. But in terms of music, yeah, I think again, it like incorporates itself in multiple ways. I think sometimes like I'll hear a piece of music and know that that's something that I want to create to, and I have like kind of 1,000,001 Spotify playlists and like YouTube playlists like going at all times, and like Shazams of things I hear anywhere that I'm like, oh, I need to know what this is for later. And just like having kind of that catalog of things that I'm like, there's something in this that I want to think about later. Or like I'll hear something and know that I want to use it, and that kind of inspires what should be attached to that piece of music. And then there are other times, and I'd say this is maybe more often, is like I'll be working on a section or a scene and find music later. Like, no, I'll have to like kind of develop the tone of what that is to know what it needs musically. Music. Yeah, and then music videos, as you said, is kind of like a whole different world. It really revolves around the music and creating a world around whatever that song is.
It makes a lot of sense when I think about both, once again, the dance play language, like translating to how music is used cinematically, right, as a sort of an ambiance that can sort of add to a tone or an emotionality of the moment, as opposed to dictating, or what sometimes is used in dance, that when choreographers Mickey Mouse to the music, the same way that Mickey Mouse as a cartoon would walk to the beat. That's not always the case, and acknowledging that lots of choreographers work different ways with music. But particularly with the music video example, and I want to make sure I get the name right, you worked with Sean McVeary, and it was a song called Maria. There's so many layers of storytelling, right? Like I would imagine that the music came first in that regard, and then you're making up a dance, and it actually was set on a stage, almost like a high school auditorium kind of thing. So now it's like the play within the play that is the song. I wanted to ask you about, because there were, it felt like the song was telling us how to watch the dance because of the, it's got lyrics and it's, much more narrative than a lot of music that's used in contemporary dance performance. But there was these moments where like balancing someone on their stomach on a sort of gentle lift, where if we were in a theater, it would be all about the pinnacle of that lift or that moment. Because of the camera as sort of an additional choreographer, we just saw this person floating. We didn't know what parts were connected to the floor or upheld by another person. Could you talk a little bit about that layer, like how you were choreographing the relationship to the camera, or how much of that was in your control, maybe even, and you were also finding other ways to collaborate?
Yeah, for sure. I think film work is something that I really came to through music videos, and it's something I'm still learning about so much. I'm very fortunate. My girlfriend is a filmmaker, and she was the director of photography on that project, and I've learned so much from just kind of being in her world for some years, and
vice versa, I think, is what was very clear in that too.
yeah, she's learned so much from me. But yeah, so like for that project specifically, there was just like months of dialogue leading up to it of like, I knew that I was going to work with Sean and we were going to make something together. And then I had all these like initial images of what that would be. I knew that I wanted it to be set on a stage, but I didn't really know what the story was yet. And the song actually went through a lot of iterations until we landed on this one. There's a huge like saxophone solo that didn't exist in the first version of it that I heard, that ended up being kind of like again like a pinnacle in the like visual representation of it. But yeah, so like from hearing the song, having these initial ideas, the story kind of like morphed out of that, and then like as I was creating the story, knowing that it was going to be represented on film, I had to kind of like work outside of the live performance realm of like knowing that so many things that you can't really accomplish when everyone is seeing all the transitions and seeing all the people and the dancing like in the flesh, that you could accomplish so many different things with film. So like for that specific moment, that I imagined it because I knew that it was going to be represented on film. So I knew that I had the ability to kind of play with orientation and not really give you the full picture, give you these small pieces of it. And then when you pull out, you could kind of see what was happening behind the scenes. But a lot of that came from being in dialogue with the other people who were on the project too, from like knowing what was possible. There were times when like I wanted there's like a ladder that kind of represents the separation of heaven and earth in this film, and I like wanted all these scenes of one of the angel characters like being on the ladder and like coming in contact with like the human character standing on the ground, and Alexa, the director of photography, was like, I just don't think that that's gonna like read the way that you think it is. And we had to like have those conversations of like what I'm seeing in my mind versus like what is possible. And yeah, I mean the choreography of that was shot all on Steadicam. So there was like a literal person with a camera on his body moving around and like has choreography around those dancers. So that was like really incredible to see too, and just like have to know where the camera is going to be when we're trying to get certain shots on this really tiny stage. So yeah, I love that idea of kind of all these other pieces being the choreography as well, aside from just what what they are dancing or the actors are doing on the stage, the choreography of the camera, and also the choreography of the edit as well.
Yeah, no, I do not make dances anymore, but I think about choreography as a form of organizing lots of things, right? Budget making, the choreography of numbers, choreographing resources and timing. And so, yeah, it definitely informed how I was also watching and seeing the film. We're going to keep talking, but I want to take a quick note to remind our friends at home following along. We would love to hear any of your questions. You don't have to wait and hold those to the end. So please feel free to drop them in the chat and they'll be sure to come our way. I have a couple more questions for Hannah myself. But yes, you are invited to chime in. So please don't be shy. What I wanted to ask that's a little bit COVID related, but we're trying to also move and think beyond COVID. When I saw some of the Red excerpt, this was your piece that's somewhat inspired by Little Red Riding Hood. I mean, yes, it had text, it had humor, it had humanity, but it was also super intimate. And by this, I'll just say to anyone who has not like traveled with dancers, dancers just have a different relationship to personal space. All you have to do is like stand in line at TSA and they're like hanging off of each other, you know, oh, can you hold this while I do that? And I mean, it's very comfortable, right? Dancers spend a lot of time in each other's physical presence. So I really like glommed onto that in watching Red because there were moments, I mean, like with each other's fingers and their mouths and belly to belly and this sort of like touch. And I'm curious, like, how do you cultivate that kind of safe intimacy, that the willingness that artists are willing, you know, to like go with you on that? Especially with, because I would imagine like if you're figuring it out along the way, there were other things that were on the cutting room floor, right? Like you don't walk in on day one and you're like, all right, I want you to put your finger in his mouth.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. How do you get to that point?
Yeah, it's so funny because I've like seen that so many times that I don't even register that as like a thing anymore. I mean, we've performed that excerpt since COVID, like in outdoor performances, and have adjusted the choreography, obviously, to be not in that intimate finger in mouth scenario.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I think I'll give you, this is like a cheat of an answer, but those two performers who perform that duet right now are like actually a couple in real life too. Mm-hmm. So there's that level of intimacy that I cannot take credit for in that scenario. But in terms of like approaching intimacy in a rehearsal room, I think it's all like in the environment that you create. And I'm like a really big and true believer of process informing product. And I think that's all in the environment you create. And I'm lucky to create with friends a lot of the time. So we have levels of intimacy there already, but I've also done a bunch of commissions where you have to kind of build that from scratch. And that's what's going to be happening when I come to GroundWorks. And I'm so excited for that and for that opportunity to just meet new performers and get to know people in that way, because I do think my process involves a lot of conversations and talking and writing about our feelings and mapping our way through pieces that aren't just like walk in, learn a step, and perform it. Yeah, actually, this reminds me of, I watched an artist talk with Rosie Herrera and David Brick. Rosie Herrera is a Miami-based dance theater choreographer recently, and she said something that was like really cool, and it was that I'm going to butcher it how I say it, but essentially that you get to like define your own virtuosity, and her virtuosity is like creating like a community and an atmosphere in a rehearsal room, and that like really struck a chord with me, and I was like, that's what I want to do too. Yeah, and I think like it's a lot of things. It's making an environment where people feel comfortable, where they can come to you if they need to, where like they know that the chain of communication is is clear and you do the right things. You use people's pronouns correctly. You are nice to each other. You respect each other. And especially with COVID, we're going to have so many extra layers of that moving forward of consent and just having to be comfortable with talking about what makes us comfortable and what doesn't make us comfortable.
We have a question from Mackenzie. I will also acknowledge Mackenzie here. I was curious if there was a specific project that you learned the most from, and if so, like what those lessons were.
Oh my God.
We'll say maybe as a maker or as a performer, because I know that you've also performed other people's work.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much. I keep talking about red, so I'm going to talk about a different one. I think you learn something from like everything you do.
But some of them cast a bigger shadow than others. So if you learned a lot from red, tell us more.
Okay, I did. I think red was kind of like the longest production that I made, and it just used text and storytelling in a new way. So I think it taught me about slowing down. I think I learned a lot of these lessons from not doing them. So like I was working on Red, which is like an almost 2-hour long production of dance, text, storytelling, singing, everything, props, all of it. And for 8 months, I like always say that I like felt like my brain was just like on fire for that entire amount of time. I was always like, all my extra moments were like writing scripts or like planning rehearsals. And it was just like the biggest thing that I had done up until that point. And I think like from not slowing down, from not giving myself the breaks that I needed to, I really learned some things that I need to incorporate into my process for taking breaks. And then the other piece that I was going to talk about is my roommate, Ryan Yamauchi, who also dances for me and is like an amazing performer and person and friend, we have lived together for 5 years now. And we actually one year, 2017 into 2018, choreographed and produced an entire evening length site specific work out of our apartment for a span of like 4 weeks, 9 shows a weekend, kind of like 2 shows a night, bringing people in. And I think like I always use that piece as an example for just creating opportunities for yourself. I think I got a really great piece of advice leaving school from Nellie Van Bommel, who is my advisor, who's also an awesome dance maker and the dean of the program now. But she said, just like however you can when you leave, just like keep making work in any capacity, just like don't stop. And for a long time, that was me making work and applying to festivals and showing like smaller pieces in like shows with a lot of people where you wouldn't get paid. And I was calling in favors from friends to dance for me for free. And this was kind of like a response to that, in like making space for ourselves in that way and taking advantage of the resources that we had. And I think that's the thing that I really learned after graduating as well, is just, you know, we all have untapped resources. And, you know, I'm speaking obviously from my own worldview and position in the world, and that is more privileged than others as well. But yeah, I think that was just like a really has stuck with me as an example of like reminding myself when I feel like there's maybe not space, that like you can also figure out how to make your own space sometimes.
There's so much in that, because what I interpolate is that you also reframed your definition of performance or success or excellence, right? That it didn't have to be at XYZ venue, that you were like, we're going to do it in our house, right? So that giving yourself that permission, I think is also about help finding a way, certainly. There, we have another question here from David Shima Takahara. You may have heard of him. And his question is, if you could talk a little bit more about how you work with humor, and, you know, as a choice, as a goal, because we all know, right, when you try to be funny, then that is like when people are not funny. So how do you find yourself navigating that in your process, and how it informs the product?
Yeah, I think like humor like weaseled its way into my work because that's like, as a person, I use humor as, you know, as most people do, as a defense mechanism, as a way to be in a social situation and just feel comfortable.
Mhm.
So, and I think I found from using it that humor can be a really effective access point into dance, especially for audiences who are not as familiar with dance or are afraid of going to it
Mhm.
and not understanding what's going on. I think humor is is something that can be relatable and emotionally accessible. And the way that I incorporate it into my work is, I mean, I think it stemmed from just not wanting to take myself so seriously. And I think it will be a lot of the times if I feel myself going down a dramatic route, my instinct is to like switch to something funny. And that kind of that flip is really interesting to me too.
Mm.
I'm not really talking about how I use it in my work.
Well, no, what I hear in that answer is a couple things. One is humor as a form of nervous relief, or nervous, like the same way people will have nervous laughter. And you're like, got too tense, like we need to sort of like turn the valve. And then also humor as it would give audiences like permission to also not overanalyze or take things so seriously. You know, even as adults, we feel more comfortable laughing because the performers have set the tone for us too with that. And that's some of those moments that I was reflecting on, where, you know, when the performers like look at each other and it's calculated, but to also like relax, that it's not only about their relationship, but I might guess also about, you know, signaling to the audience, it's okay. It's all right. We don't have to always be doing serious concert dance.
Yeah, and as performers, it also, you know, it gives you a chance to like land back in yourself and be in the moment
Mhm.
during a performance. So much of humor is about timing. Sometimes
Mhm.
and sometimes you don't, and like you really have to be keyed into to what's happening in the moment to for it to be like really successful. And I also think like um something that interests me about humor is that humor and tragedy are really two sides of the same coin, and
Mhm.
the flip between those can be really interesting. So you can be like walking like a really serious route, and then by flipping it to it's like that transition isn't actually as it might feel jarring as you're watching it, but like it might actually be like a really natural transition.
Mhm. Mhm. No, it makes me think of those, whether they're movies or something, and if you turn off the sound, you can't tell if they're crying or laughing, because the face, you know, will contort some in similar ways.
Mhm.
I'm not familiar with your father's work, so I'm curious, like, what an amazing gift for you to be able to grow up and spend so much time in the theater and surrounded by the performing arts. Do you tap him as a resource dramaturgically, or you know, in terms of guiding and when you're working on something?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I tap both of my parents like in my lineage and my history of like growing up watching Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin and kind of like those more physical comedy.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
You've
then
got some embedded humor work there. Yeah.
um and then yeah, I mean more recently I have like had my dad come into rehearsals and just like watch and give us feedback or thoughts on just what he gets from something, and some of those can be really specific. Like he'll be like, oh, you use this line a few times in red, like you should deliver it the same way each time, so the audience like clocks that
Mm-hmm.
or it'll just be questions that he has, and that's been really helpful. And I would be like remiss to say that my mother, I have also tapped her for a lot of help in the past, but that will be a lot of emotional support. Calling her and crying that everything's terrible, and then it being okay.
Yeah, we all can't help but take our work home with us. So it's good to hear that you have support both inside the studio and out. I'm gonna just take a quick moment because we're sort of rounding the corner. I have a couple more questions, but I will acknowledge to our friends following along, you know, don't hold back on your questions. Feel free to drop those into the chat. So we'll make sure to get to them before we sign off in about 10-15 minutes. But Hannah, what can you tell us about your work with GroundWorks? What are you cooking up? What are you sort of journaling and writing about?
Yeah, great question. There, you know, I'll preface this by saying there are so many unknowns, right? This is kind of one of the first processes I'm going into in COVID that hasn't been like just like a single person that I'm working with. It's five amazing performers who I have yet to meet, but dancers and bodies that I don't know in a location that I have not been to that we will be shooting a film in. That being said, I am so excited because we will be creating a 10 to 15 minute dance film. And yeah, what I'm thinking about is, believe it or not, how I'm feeling these days and just what I'm going through. And I think it has been just like a lot of sitting and dreaming and like solo thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm thinking a lot about kind of like reintroduction to touch and to contact. And I think we all understand probably where that's coming from these days.
That is real. No, absolutely.
Kind of like barriers to that, be it like the obvious things that we think about now when we think of distance, which is, 6 feet. It's masks, it's distance that is time, it's 2 weeks of quarantining, it's distance between the people that we're not able to see. So I think that with those things in mind, I've just been like kind of tapping into some imagery and doing some writing, and I think I have like a handful of just scenes that I'm interested in playing with. And I haven't talked to you about any of this, but there are things that I've kind of developed in the past few weeks. But I'm thinking about kind of like a self-help seminar scenario that is about how we reconnect with each other. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about kind of like props to bring into the space that can exist as barriers between us, and how we use those and how we remove those. And that's existing right now in my brain as kind of like purple Easter grass that I've been using, which if you don't know what Easter grass is just like strips of little pieces of like plastic that you put all together and it looks like a pile of some kind of like grass stuff. And I've been writing scripts like about closeness and how we start things, how we start processes, and how it's harder to do that now, how starting is harder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a question that we have here from Hallie, which I think also points out, there are some choreographers that will walk into a room, they really rely on the dancers to sort of devise. They'll say, give them a prompt and dancers will improvise, and a choreographer says, yes, more of that, everyone learn that. Because you are working somewhat with a script as well and writing such a part of it, when you talk about developing story or narratives, how much do the dancers that are working with you in the room influence those narratives you're creating, and how much of them are about you asking them to try them on, but it still is your vision?
Mm-hmm. 50-50 on both of those, I'd say.
Yeah. Both are great tools to have. So there's no one way of doing it. Yeah.
I'm saying this out loud for you and also to hear it myself, but I can plan and write and devise all these things, and I will not know until I'm in the space with those people and they bring their artistry and themselves and their humanity to it. And that is how we devise a piece, and so much of it will be dependent on them. I'm not someone who will walk into a space and be like, do a solo and then claim it as my own choreography, but I am someone who will ask for creativity from performers. I will know the structure of something, and if I want 5 bodies moving through each other, I will specifically direct without necessarily giving each person the exact step that will happen. But I think this process and this product will be really informed by the dancers and what we're able to do together. And I hope that we're able to just create an environment that we can do that in.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to close with one question, because we do have a lot of students in the Northeast Ohio area, also a part of the GroundWorks family. And if there's any advice that you would want to impart to someone who is trying to carve out their own creative career, pandemic be damned, wherever we go, but just trying to do the work and keep moving forward, what might you offer them?
I mean,
you can borrow from someone else.
Yeah. I was gonna say I would offer the same thing that Nellie offered to me, which was don't stop when you graduate. Just keep finding ways to make work. And I think, like, for me, I'm like a workhorse, and I like want to just like I'll just spend like all my time working and forget to take breaks, like I said before. So that's not like an invitation to like kill yourself over making stuff, but it's like an invitation to just find alternative routes or find ways to continue to make things. This is kind of like a summary of some other things that I said, but continue to use your resources. I think if you're teaching, and all of this, it's so different with COVID now, and the resources that you have available to you are different. But if you teach at a dance school, stay late, come early, use the space to make things, trade for stuff. Find your friends who, so many dancers have side hustles too. Find your friends who are writers. Find your friends who do arts management, admin, grant writing on the side, and tap them for things, and trade with them. Give them a class for free. Give them a phrase for them to use in their dance reel, because they're dancers too. And I think like something that I will always have to remind myself is that everyone has their own timeline as well. And you can look to other people as mentors and examples, but that will never be exactly what happens for you. And make yourself and know that there is space for everyone, and there should be. And that's, again, speaking from my worldview as a cis white woman, is different than it will be for other people, but not coming from a naive place of it already exists. But oftentimes there needs to be work to have that.
In hearing that, it reminds me of something else that you had said. You had referenced hearing Rosie Herrera talk about like being able to define virtuosity and excellence for yourself. And I think then marrying that or laying it on top of everyone has their own timeline, right? Is about creating, like, it is your own path, for better or worse, is something I always like to say in this field. There is no one way of doing it, which could be frustrating, right? There are other fields when you're going to go for X number of years of school, you're going to become this after a while, you make X amount of dollars. That is not the path of the performing arts. even before COVID. And I think the resourcefulness that the performing arts brings that we have brought to keep going, to keep making and moving forward is what's carrying us through in this moment. And it's about how do we continue that after COVID as well. So,
and you know, the performing arts, the artists are people who have been hurt really badly at this time, but also they're the people that we turn to in this time of fear and isolation. When we watch movies, we watch TV, we listen to podcasts, we go to live shows outside, like those are the people that we turn to populate our world with beauty and hope. And that's so important.
yes. And I think that I'm not alone with those that are tuning in, that we are looking forward to turning to what you make with GroundWorks and getting to witness it later this spring. Thank you so much, Hannah, for being so candid with us and open about your process and introducing yourself to Northeast Ohio and everyone tuning in. Thank you to David and GroundWorks for having us and putting us together. Hannah and I didn't know each other beforehand. Super excited to stay in touch. That's all we have to say for now. Have a good night, y'all. Bye.